All right. So everybody, just cleaning up some language. We'll call this meeting to order at 8:03 a.m. A couple things on business, discussion of some FY25 updates since last Wednesday, but we're going to start first with FY26 for our kind friends at the town hall. Joanna McCarthy and Amy Dexter here. Thank you all both so much for joining us. I think the point of this discussion for framing for everybody is just to get clarity on the select board vote last Tuesday, where the select board voted for the 9.5 million level service, but the allocation of schools was 5.7, not 6.4, and essentially there was the $700,000 amount was kind of discussed in the select board meeting around pulling that from special ed circuit breaker reserve into a town reserve. So I think it's just to be helpful as from the school committee perspective, we're going to need to figure out what this means for our budget requests and if we need to change our FY26 budget requests in any way. And so just get clarity on kind of how the town views that change. Obviously, they're not the select boards, they did not vote on it, but so they would have some information to share. So I think that's the framing. Does that sound right to you, Amy?
Yes, Nick's on his way.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to wait for him or.
I wasn't expecting it, so
Okay.
I defer to you, Amy, on if it's information that we can talk about now, or if we need to wait on Nick because he has information beyond what y'all.
I think it's fine if we move forward. So did you just ask me a question? I'm sorry, I was a little distracted.
No, I know you're on vacation, Amy, and we really appreciate you joining us from Florida. I think the question is just how does the town see like the use of that $700,000 that again was kind of not allocated to the schools through the override request and was put into this kind of reserve account on the town side? What is the vision for that? And from my perspective, I would assume that means the schools, we need to cut $700,000 from our FY26 budget request. That's how I see that, but I just want to make sure that it's right. And if there's other context that
So the way Nick and I view it and have discussed it is, it was our understanding the way it was presented in the FY26 request is that it's a replenishment of the circuit breaker reserve, that the schools used it for the FY24 budget to close that deficit that was there at the end of 24. We don't believe that it's appropriate to include it in the override, which would be a permanent inclusion in the school budget moving forward indefinitely. And therefore, our proposal was to take that out and to fund that $700,000 plus an additional $300,000 to the special ed stabilization fund that was requested to be set up. So we didn't view it as a cut. We viewed it as, okay, recognize that the school potentially will have a need for that, for special ed, to put it in this separate fund and not only fund the 700, but up that to $1 million so that there's even more resources there, with the understanding that we would have to consider funding it again moving forward next year. But at this point, we didn't think it was appropriate to include it in the override.
And the $700,000 on the town side, that is in order to establish a fund to help offset increases in operating costs in the out years to push the override out, another override out as far as possible. Is that a fair way of that?
Correct. It was our understanding that the select board, wanted to be able to say if we were asking for this 9.5 million, that it would be sustainable for, 3 to 5 years. The only way we could really get that to work without cutting operating budgets was to put some additional recurring funds into this operating stabilization fund. It just so happens that it's the same 700,000 number because we were trying to make sure we didn't go over the 9.5 because we knew some select board members were, had expressed concerns of the dollar amount being high. But we stuck to that. We felt it needed to be the 9.5, and this was a way that we could get through the next 4 years without having to go ask the taxpayers for another override in the near future, with the understanding that that's only as good as our estimates are, right? So if something significant changes and some of our estimates are deemed to be too low going forward, then, it might not be that 4 years that we're projecting today, but we're hopeful that we can get there.
I was just going to put a fine point on what Amy said there about the $700,000 being the same number is in large part coincidental, but really just math in order to make this work, right? So it wouldn't, from my perspective, and I think fair to say from the town's perspective, that it's not, pulling it from one place, that exact 700 and putting it elsewhere, right? If that makes sense. And then just to back up on the very first thing that Amy said, I would emphasize the intent being to remove this part of the budget, the level service budget that ultimately would have requested the 9.5 million as part of all departmental roll-ups, right? Ultimately would have requested the full 9.5 million, but this $700,000 reduction to the circuit breaker reserve replenishment felt like it was more of a one-time buildup rather than best practice being to, and instead of best practice being not to put that into an override number that would be permanent and thus part of the tax levy moving forward. So I think collectively we felt like the $1 million in this new special education stabilization fund, which will be an article in May at annual town meeting to set this up, felt like it was going to attain the same and or similar goals, right? And thus there would be extra money there in order to do what I think the circuit breaker reserve was looking to do. Now the replenishment is another thing entirely, right? And I think Katie is likely closer to that of wanting to build that up from a best practice standpoint to, is it a year? I think, I mean, ultimately, I think it's clear that that reserve needs to be built back up. Doing it through the tax levy on a permanent basis felt like maybe not the thing that we needed to do at this time. And this special education stabilization fund would effectively get us, I think, what we need from hope to get us what we need from a coverage for special education costs, unanticipated special education costs in FY26.
So can I just ask clarifying, so if we don't build it into the operating, into the override budget, right, which essentially.
The replenishment.
Yeah, which is 700,000, right, the amount that we talked about to help try and build back the reserves. So if we don't build that within the override budget, which is just our budget for next year, how do y'all anticipate us ever being able to do that, I guess is my question. And unless it's the town's expectation that next year the school department would essentially ask to use a significant amount of the special ed reserve account in the first year, which if that's the expectation of the town, I would just want to ask you to make that very clear to residents, because like, to me, it would come across really poorly as we're talking about creating sustainability within the budget and creating an FY26 budget that we can work within, to then come back next April, whatever the appropriate time is, to say, hey, we actually need $700,000 to
Which we knew we needed.
fix,
Right.
yeah, which we knew and we asked for. And so I guess that's the place I'm struggling with, of just like, what is then the mechanism, if we're not building into the override budget, where we can address this?
So I guess I think that's where the disconnect between how the schools is viewing this replenishment and the towns is viewing it is if the FY26 request truly includes all of your positions and all of the funding on your expense line items, I don't understand how you're viewing it as not funding this replenishment request would affect that. Why you're viewing that as a cut? Because the circuit breaker is, I thought that was for unexpected special ed costs. So I'm just having a hard time comprehending why it's being viewed as a cut when it was presented as replenishment of the circuit breaker. You're still going to get, if your special ed expenses were extremely high in 25, and there's a timing difference between when you receive the circuit breaker reimbursement, then you should be getting more reimbursement than last year. I'm just having a really hard time following the logic of why it's a cut when all we're doing is reducing this. Sounds like you're trying to build back the reserves, and that really shouldn't be part of the override. So I'm having a hard time connecting the dots with that.
Maybe if I can just provide some clarification. So I think to Amy's point, when we build the budget in October, specific to special ed, but it's consistent across the board. The budget was built based off of actual expenditures from FY24. And so at that time for special ed, we built the budget with tuition, transportation, and contracted services based off of the actuals for the previous fiscal year. Since that time, the transportation expense and the contracted services expense lines have both increased by almost $300,000. And so that's another $700,000 in expenses that are known expenses for this fiscal year that will be known expenses for the next fiscal year. And so in order for us to balance the budget next year and to not have to take funds from other lines, we would need to spend at this point at least 2.8, so 2.72 in circuit breaker in order to not impact the operating budget. And so if we were, based off of what we know to date in March, if we were to say we're only gonna have, $700,000 less in circuit breaker, we would need to make that funding up elsewhere in the operating budget. And so in order for the funding to be sustainable, we need to look elsewhere. We can't touch special ed costs because the special ed costs aren't going down. And this is just based off of known expenses in March of 2025 that we know will carry forward into fiscal year 26. And we can't, we shouldn't be using stabilization funds because they're known expenses. And so the more appropriate way would be to build it into the operating budget for next year, because it is truly an operating expense. It's not a one-time expense.
So my question then would be, when we talked about it last time, it was a replenishment of the reserve, and now we're saying that the FY26 budget isn't really appropriate for special ed costs. It's just very confusing because it's the first time I've heard that you're projecting that the special ed costs are going to be more than what was requested.
Yeah,
So I think it's how it was presented, how the 700,000 was presented as a replenishment, and
yeah.
it sounds like maybe circumstances have changed around that now. And maybe that's where the disconnect is.
And I think based off of the original numbers, it would be correct in the framing of it would be $700,000 that could stay in circuit breaker that we could use to fund any unanticipated, unexpected costs. And then it was more appropriately built into the operating budget. But because of the special education budget, because of the we truly didn't know some of these costs. And if we look at even transportation, it was the budget right now for fiscal year 25 is 1.8 million, and we're projected to spend 3.1 million. And so that's a big piece of the deficit that we're seeing for this fiscal year and that we're trying to address in FY 26. And so we can address that through operating budget funding and using the circuit breaker reserve. Absent of that funding, we either have to take it from someplace else in the operating budget, which is going to impact our other services, or we're going to have to, using the special ed stabilization fund is one-time funding, and then it's going to have to get built into the operating budget in the future, and then it is going to impact the sustainability of the override. Because
Isn't using circuit breaker also one time?
no, it's recurring because we get it every year. And then the fluctuations get built into the operating budget. And so next year, we will probably have to use all of our circuit breaker funding. And so we won't have the ability to build up any of the reserve.
So I just have concerns with the fact that this is year 2 of an operating deficit, and that I haven't seen any real movement to try to absorb that other than talk about free cash use and some other one-time things, and that we're then building this into 26. Still with no discussion about some things that could happen to help absorb those cost increases. And I know that we don't have to figure that out today, but that's where we were kind of coming from, is this is a problem from 24. It shouldn't be built into the budget, but it sounds like now there's a different take on it, is it's not really a replenishment. It's that you need it because your costs are going to be higher than the line items in the budget are. And it's not really the replenishment. So maybe it needs to be, represented that way, or.
Yep. And so, Amy, I don't disagree with you, but I don't think it's a different take. I think it's just an approach in budgeting to say, how are we going to address certain expenses? And we know that special ed is volatile, and we know that the costs are increasing, and we know that the budget was built inappropriately in the past. And so I didn't know in October, I don't think any of us knew in October, that by increasing it to what the actuals were in a previous year, and even adding kind of a percentage increase, assuming that there were going to be cost escalations for our existing expenses, I didn't know that that was going to be $600,000 less than what we were actually going to need next year. But I do know that having circuit breaker funding from the previous fiscal year is a tool that we can utilize to offset the expenses so that we don't have to cut money in a current operating year. And so that is how the budget was built. Now, looking at the budget, the way that it's currently built and proposed, it would be the only way for us to cut our budget based off of the expenses that we know on March 17th is to reduce by 700,000 in other places, because we are going to need that circuit breaker funding next year for special ed costs. we're gonna need them. There's no, unless, like, I don't think that $700,000 worth of expenses are going anywhere for just in that area. So we just need to be able to address it in other ways so that it gives us it ensures sustainability, and so that we don't have to come back next year and say, oops, we're in the same spot we were last year.
And so if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, the million, now not just 700, but $1 million in the sped stabilization, the concerns around that are because it's not, because it's funded with free cash. Because I think the public would like the transparency of the stabilization fund.
Yeah,
Where, we have to request from the school committee and the select board to be able to access it. And I think that there's a lot of chatter out there that's a concern. So I mean, we can agree to disagree on how we're looking at it. I understand what you're saying. I would need Nick to, chime in on it. I see he just walked in. So I don't want to sit here and, keep going back and forth about the difference of opinion on it. But we felt that by funding that sped stabilization fund and making an effort to try to continually fund that in the future when there's, funds available, that was a way of recognizing the need on the school side, maybe addressing some of the public's concerns and making it more transparent.
Yeah, and so I think I had brought up the fact that we could establish a special ed stabilization fund. There are very clear policies that we'll be able to put into place to make sure that we're using it appropriately. And it also provides transparency so that in order to draw from the special ed stabilization fund, it needs to be approved. The very specific expenses need to be approved by both the school committee and the select board. And so I do think that it is a good tool that we should have and put in place moving forward. I also think that it will be a tool for us for next year when the expenses, so right now the budget, I'll use transportation as an example. Our budget was appropriated at 1.8 million. Our projected expenses this year are 3.1 million. If we had a special ed stabilization fund that was already put into place and funded for this year, we would be able to use whatever was available to us in that fund to be able to offset any of the unanticipated, unexpected expenses for transportation for this year. That's one-time funding. You then have to build those expenses into your operating budget, or else you'll have the same exact problem in an upcoming fiscal year. And so I think that's the process that we are trying to, and that is the budgeting model that we are trying to create. Just knowing that we know now with these expenses so that we don't, again, have to impact the operating budget. The situation that we have for 25, we don't have the funding to offset that $1 million increase. And so we've had to freeze budget lines in other areas of the budget, general education, other areas, to be able to offset some of that expense, some of that overage. And I think that's what we're looking to try to prevent in the future. But I just think based off of what I see now and the expenses that we currently know for special education, if we are cutting the budget by 700,000, we shouldn't cut it from special ed. We need to cut it in another area that is going to ensure sustainability.
Just for the record, I never said to cut special ed. I don't.
So a reduction to circuit breaker, for us to reflect that in the budget, we would have to increase the special ed funding from the operating budget. So that's essentially like reducing the funding.
So just to clarify, if you're taking 700 to make up the difference in special ed, you'll have to take it from like general ed or somewhere else.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, so someone's gonna miss out, basically.
Can I just reset here? Now that Nick's here.
Yeah, thank you for joining me.
I think if I can interpret this conversation, it's likely confusion around the line item as presented on the school budget for circuit breaker reserve replenishment, right? And I think that was what, I mean, the word replenishment, I think was what was focused on, right? So what I'm hearing is that as of today, that wouldn't be replenishment, that would actually be known use of funds in fiscal year 26 because of escalation of costs from the FY24 actuals, right?
Mhm.
Okay. That's just my like summarization of where we're at here.
Yeah.
So we talked about, thinking about the replenishment outside of the override and from a permanent basis. And I think what we're learning today is that those are actual.
It's good to hear. It's good to have that information. I think I still view it the same way. And if the school committee is looking for a different override approach, they can make that request to the select board. I think going around in circles nuts with this group as we've done and discussed and argued over it and have a difference of opinion on it. I think at some point, if the school committee feels differently about how the override should be structured, make a request to the select board. But this is how we viewed to set it up. This is how I was able to work with members to have a unanimous vote on an override number that is going to voters. If that is not something the school committee agrees with or wants to see structured differently, then I think the ball is in your court to state that. But this has been a long process. The school budget has gone up 19% in 2 years. So I think at some point, select board had to say, we have a number and we're moving forward. If members view it differently, that's understandable. But I think that the ball is in the school committee's court to say we do want a different structure. We want something different. And if so, I just don't want to spend a lot of time. I feel like we're defending ourselves a lot here, and I'm okay with that. But Amy's on vacation. I would love to let her get back to her vacation because I feel like we've been through this. Perspectives are shared, and so that's kind of where things rest.
So are you saying that obviously the overall number of 9.5 isn't changing, but because of like us taking that 700 and putting it in a stabilization fund, are you saying that you won't get that in from the other select board?
I think we have a unanimous vote to structure an override this way, and the vote is in 6 weeks. I think it's kind of baked in at this point, unless the school committee wants to request something different.
Yeah, Nick, I just, to be clear here, coming out of Tuesday's meeting, right, both Amy and Joanna offered to come to Monday, so I don't think we were like bringing anybody here to grill them. I think I honestly, coming out of Tuesday's meeting, had, and talking kind of as we were walking out, just like potentially a difference of understanding or wasn't clear as to the goal of the 700,000 and wanted to make sure we were clear. So as you say, as a school committee, we can discuss and know how to move forward on. I think within that conversation at the select board, I don't think it was framed in the way of like, hey, the school's request is actually being cut, right? And again, and potentially that's because that's not how y'all were interpreting it within that vote, and which is fine and totally get that. But I do think we're at a place now where what I'm hearing from Katie, based upon the new, is like there is going to need to be, and the point you made earlier, Amy, of like, I don't see why you need to cut. Hopefully we all, at least I see like why we would need to cut in order to hit the number that has been set by the select board. And I'm not saying my personal opinion at this point of like whether or not I support that or not, or think we should argue. I know we're very short on time. I know this impacts a lot of people and we want to all be on the same page pushing forward, because the not getting even the 5.7 is going to be terrible for our staff and our kids. So I think that is something we need to discuss. I just think it's important to make sure that the school committee members like understood the town's perspective and also understood kind of Katie's perspective. So don't mean to make y'all feel defensive or anything like that, that we can agree to disagree. I think we all have the best interest. I'll say from the town side, you know, when we came, we asked y'all to build in some sustainability within the budget. Y'all are doing that with the $700,000. So personally, I appreciate that tact because that helps push the override to 4 years, which I think is at least what we're going to need in order to get support for any future overrides. So I appreciate that. It comes with downsides. It appears the school department's budget that we just need to figure out as a committee. And I don't know if we have clarity on that yet. But any other questions from members to, I don't want to hold the town staff and especially Amy on her vacation up. Anything else y'all want to share? Amy, Joanna, before we let y'all go? Thank you. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Have a good vacation. Sorry to bother you. Really appreciate you agreeing to come.
Thanks, Amy.
All right. Other questions from school committee members regarding kind of our next steps for FY26?
Mark,
Yeah,
so you said for FY26.
yeah.
So Danielle, we've talked about her coming Wednesday, I believe. So I think that would be important for us to understand sort of where the costs are coming from that will increase FY26 for special ed, and to understand, you know, kind of as we've talked about before, maybe what the process is for balancing that or checking the sort of checks and balances, so that we're aware throughout the year of any like changes in the student population or changes in transportation or other places. So I think that piece will be important for us to know, so that we know that the number that we're looking at for 26, and I appreciate that it was built on 24, but if there, you know, so that we have a better understanding next year through the budget or through the year, that we have early clarity on any changes and that we have a process in place to make sure we're knowing about that ahead of time. So I know that we're going to talk about that Wednesday, but I think that will be a really important piece.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's connected with like some of the sustainability measures or the like checks and balances measures we talked about.
Yeah.
Sure. What I have for you, Katie, is I think it is fair to say that, again, our initial framing around this circuit breaker was to like try and build some cushion within this ever-changing special education, right? The costs have been increasing significantly over the past several years. We are now saying that they've increased so much this year that we expect next year we actually won't have any of the cushion we were hoping for, even if the select board hadn't, you know, voted that and pulled that into a different. Not that it's the same money to Joanne's point, but anyways. So I guess my question is, even with the assuming like using the full 2.8 of the circuit breaker instead of the 2 million, how much, what is like the percent increase we are carrying or assuming for special education costs next year? And how does that compare to the percent increase we saw this year, the percent increase we saw last year? And so just wondering, given that has been the most significant driver of kind of our budgetary challenges, like feels like we do need to build a good cushion to anticipate those. So just wondering how you're thinking about that more.
Yes, so I think that was initially the approach with the circuit breaker funding. So when we build the budget, when we create the budget, it's very much based off of each individual kind of need. So when we talk about out of district tuition, it's we build the budget based off of each student and then the known cost. And when we build the budget, we don't build the budget kind of with a cushion, right? We're building the budget just based off of the known expenses. And with special education, it changes. It's not as predictable as some of the other areas in the budget. And typically, to be able to cover those expenses, you would have circuit breaker funding or some outside funding source to be able to do that. And so that was the mechanism that we used kind of to build the budget for 26. It was based off of known expenses from the previous fiscal year for the number of students and number of placements that we have for this current year, assuming that they would be staying in a similar placement for next year based off of the rate increases that were set by the state. And if there were any changes, we had initially proposed the budget with having circuit breaker funds, not fully utilizing the full reimbursement, knowing that in past fiscal years that there have been shifts, that we do have students that either move in or students that are placed out of district, kind of newly placed out of district. And so we'll be using at this time, based off of the known expenses, using the majority of that circuit breaker funding. And so if there are any increased expenses, which there may potentially be, but I don't know, like I'd have to look at what the overall increase has been year to year. I know the past couple of years, it's been a 15% increase. We could potentially use the stabilization fund to fund that, but otherwise, we would have to just fund it with other lines within the operating budget.
Yeah, I think just though to your point, like we have to assume some type of increase next year, right? That is not unexpected cost. Like
Right.
if special ed jumps up 15% next year because it's jumped up 15% this year and last year and the year before, that is not an unexpected cost. And so we at some point have to figure out how we are building that into, I guess, our budget, although on an annual basis, again, if special ed is going up 15% and our budget's going up to 0.5%, 4%, then it just necessitates kind of cutting into other areas of the budget to balance that. But yeah, I obviously remain, as I think we all do, extremely concerned that we were just like that the cut of or the reduction to 5.7 from 6.4 in some way makes us kind of do what we've done in the past years, which is like budget so tightly that actually we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure, as it appears happened in FY24 and as it happened in FY25. And so just how do we do that? I guess is where I look to you on them, what those numbers need to be to assume. And so does this mean that we need to find cuts elsewhere in the budget that equal that 700,000? Does it mean we actually need to cut deeper in order to get to the 700,000 because you're assuming 2.8 on the circuit breaker, but we need to carry an extra 200,000? Like, I don't know what the numbers are, not obviously any number, but that is the direction I think I would look for you to give us to say like what is going to make us feel pretty good based upon the trends that we've seen over the last few years, especially.
I think the difficult portion too with special ed or with any of the budget lines really is a portion of the work that we're doing this year truly is just a kind of right size. And so even though the budget was 1.7 million for transportation historically and 1.8 million, we know that the expenses were much larger than that. And so we truly are just trying to make sure that the budget is reflecting what the known expenses are. So for just specific to circuit breaker, so for this year, our reimbursement was 3.1 million. And so next year, if the reimbursement is similar, if it's also 3.1 million, right now, I believe that we would have to use the 2,725,000 just to make sure that the budget was balanced. And that is not taking into account reducing the 700,000. And so if we still had that 700,000 built into the budget and we received 3.1 from circuit breaker, we would have a little bit of a cushion. If the budget, the increase is going to be the 5.7 million and not the 6.4 that was in the 9.4% level service increase, we could potentially cut a small portion for circuit breaker, but I wouldn't recommend cutting the full 700,000 from circuit breaker, because I think we'll just be in the same position next year, just based off of historical expenditures and the increases that we've seen, and that we have zero kind of balance that we've carried forward. We've carried forward at least $300,000 in circuit breaker since I believe it was 2015. And so the fact that we started this year with zero in circuit breaker, I think is makes trying to balance the budget for this year even more difficult, because we don't have any funding that we can pull from. And so if we fully utilized 3.1 million in circuit breaker next year, I think we're just gonna continue to have the same problem in future fiscal years until we address it.
Yeah, I'm still not clear what the other strategy is to build a reserve within the circuit breaker account without pushing that funding into the operating budget.
Well, it would be sort of hoping that next year and the year after that, the select board would choose with the town administrator to take free cash in those out years and continue putting in an amount the way they're proposing to do this year, right? So.
Into the stabilization.
Yeah,
fund.
yes.
Yes.
So it's just, which I obviously sitting here now, there's no guarantee that would happen, but I think what has been shared with us is there is an intent for that to happen. And in that, if one sort of takes the leap of faith that could happen, then I understand the rationale that is potentially not so different from what we have proposed. It would just mean that at a certain point, once the reserve had been replenished efficiently, then the select board could stop making that choice each year, right? That's how I'm understanding this conversation, that it would depend upon that sort of to happen in the future years, which you're having built it into the operational budget, was trying to just avoid the need to rely upon something we cannot know now, which is whether or not future select boards would choose to continue allocating into this new stabilization.
But if I was following you, Katie, wasn't sort of the building it into the operating budget added an additional buffer? So I'm thinking like the stabilization fund is a tool by which, if whatever buffer you have is not sufficient at the end, then you go into the fund as the last resort, and then say, oh, okay, what increases in transportation are looking this way now that we know, and you build it into the next budget so that you're only tapping into that stabilization fund for those one-time
Yeah.
incremental increases that you hadn't anticipated,
Yes.
right? But it's not sort of, it doesn't function the same way as circuit breaker. So it's two different tools to try to get to a balanced budget at the end of the year.
I guess the other way is the town could approach this, and I say town, because I think this is outside of school committee, but is to treat special education similar to how we treat snow removal, and that we actually just know we're not fully allocating the appropriate amount of money for this one action, right? And we've been needing to create this other, you're gonna use on an annual basis some free cash. That to me doesn't feel like, but again, that is something like we obviously do within certain operating costs such as so.
We, just to clarify, I don't want to conflate issues, but we don't use free cash to cover the deficit, so we've created it within the DPW budget and other town departments and the reserve fund when necessary.
Yeah, the reserve fund, which is comparable, I think, to the stabilization fund. Sorry, thank you for the clarification.
So wouldn't it be like in terms of optics, like if you're going up for an override that's pretty large, right? Isn't it better to sell the override that the school can balance its own budget instead of having to go back to the town every year? Whatever stabilization fund or however that grows through free cash, there is that perception that the school is going back to the town every year because we don't know how to balance our budget. I don't think that's a good.
It's a difference of opinion in terms of what should be structured into the recurring override or not. So our view was, if we're going to be building and strengthening reserves through the override, it should be for a townwide operating budget stabilization fund that funds all town and school potential expenses in future years. And if there's years with good free cash, then we can make some down payments to help the schools get their circuit breaker reserve back to where they want it to be. So it's just that's two different approaches to it. And, you know, I offered three options. I identified what I thought was a better pathway, which is the one the select board chose, but we did show different scenarios of that. It pushes the override even more expensive to not go this route. But I think where it felt like there was consensus was $9.5 million felt like an okay number for an override. Let's structure it slightly differently. And that's how it was voted. Again, so there is money, it's being set aside for stabilization in two ways. One first bed with free cash at $1 million, the other recurring part of the override for town and school budgets. So it's shared, subject to approval of the town meeting by 2/3 vote to withdraw from there. So there's safeguards on it as well, but it's just two different ways to approach it.
I hope it's, do you mind if I jump in?
The other thing is, if in three, let's say, and it probably won't happen with the economics of what's going on with federal funding and everything else, but the state made a big jump in circuit breaker next year. And now that's part of the base school budget to build it back up over a certain amount of time, then that problem is resolved sooner. And the money's just in the school budget. So I think there are fares over that as well from my perspective. So again, keeping ideas of putting money in stabilization, yes. Making it available for town and schools is my preferred.
So, and in that instance though, if that happens and we receive more circuit breaker, then we can build that into the budget for future years. So the hope is that for fiscal year 27, we're not building in the 2.8 that we can build in. If we get 3.5, then we can build in 3 million. And then the ask from the town is reduced. And if the ask from the town is reduced, then that is ensuring sustainability from the override for more than 3 or 4 years. So I think like we truly are trying to approach it in a way that we're not having these kind of like major fluctuations in requests for the operating budget. We want to make sure that the ask and that the funding that we're asking for the town to cover is reasonable and sustainable based off of what the town's funding situation looks like. So I think that is that is the hope, that we could potentially get more money in circuit breaker, and then we can utilize that to offset expenses. It is a reimbursement program, so I think there is danger in saying we'll get more, because that means that we're spending more. And so, but that is something that, you know, we'll have to consider, just moving forward.
And I think the only thing I was going to chime in to suggest here is that, remember, there's in addition to the 1 million in this scenario going into a special education stabilization fund, there would be another 2.5 million funded with free cash into general stabilization operating budget stabilization. So remember that what we're trying to do here is just like put it away, right? This is all for the rainy day, for whether it be town or schools or what. And, you know, with hope we can grow those amounts during a year or two. And I, you know, I think that to the extent that that special education stabilization fund, as potentially we talk about this in May's town meeting and setting this up, if we think it's quite likely that we will tap into, the school department will make a request for funds from fiscal year 26. We talk about that, right? And but that's what that's for, right? And with hope, we will continue to put enough in there to make that feel like it will be at a good place for out years.
I think that's such an important point to, if this is the way we're moving forward, to just help manage expectations. Because we are, you know, I think the urgency that people are looking for from the schools, this is it right here. It's us. And I know, Nick, I sympathize with the idea that like, we're still here, we're still talking about it, but we're still talking about it out of that sense of urgency that we are trying to like avoid repeating, you know, this situation. So that's the reason for it. And so I think just helping make sure that we're able to remember a year from now that this conversation took place, you know, so that we are able to just help. That to me is part of the rebuilding of the trust, is that like we are having this conversation right now.
And to your point, Lizzie, I think that the transparency necessary to pull funds out of that special education stabilization fund, I think will be important from a public standpoint as well, right? Like,
For sure.
And I think that that's, you know, based on, I think what we've all heard, right? I think that is and can be a really good mechanism for communication around this substantially increasing cost.
That's absolutely true. And so just, I think what I'm hoping is that the town, when we come to the point of, you know, of that request and conversation, I just really hope that it will be received as like what we're sort of agreeing on right here, and not as, oh my gosh, here come the schools again, like asking for something that they didn't, you know, because that dynamic is really challenging for the idea of the transparency. I'm not saying that's what's happening right now, but I think just bigger picture in terms of the sense. And I think that's what we're trying to stop so that we can function more functionally, you know?
And
I think we all want that. So
that's why when we structured it, wasn't just a $700,000 appropriation. It was structured to be an $1 million appropriation for fiscal 26, because the idea, understanding the impact of schools in 26, wanting to mitigate that, and also put in a more above and beyond that for potential use in future years to make an initial payment above and beyond what might be expected in 26. Essentially. So that was it. To join this one is kind of why more than 700,000. for this part. You know, impacts 26 and beyond, let's start making some.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. Hi.
Yeah.
Hanging out over here. So just for clarity, for my sake of kind of what I'm hearing, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. So for this year, recognizing that that isn't in there for next year, and we know that the costs are higher than we anticipated this year. Are we essentially saying that that 700 will come out of the general fund, come out of we have to reallocate or relook at the budget for 26, recognizing that that 700 isn't there? Or a portion of that, I think what Katie was saying is to not use the full amount of circuit breaker so that we do have a little bit of a cushion. But if we know that our costs are coming in higher and we're basing it on actuals for 25, then that money needs to come from elsewhere in our current 26 budget. Is that correct, or am I misinterpreting?
That's my understanding.
Okay.
So I'm going to be mindful of the time. It's 9 o'clock, and I think we have a couple things starting off for FY25. So I do think that our next step, from my perspective, of looking at the numbers, would be to ask Peter and Katie to create a new proposal for the FY26 budget that takes into account this $700,000 reduction, the total allocation to the schools. Just how does that play out? Maybe that part is reduction, circuit breaker expectation. I would assume they're going to come back with some suggested cuts to.
Proposal for the school committee to consider,
Yeah.
not for the select.
No,
Yeah, just.
the select board has
Yeah.
set the number, and then we determine how we operate.
Yeah,
under
so
that.
we are not, so Nick, you had opened the door to us coming back to propose something else to the select board. I think we're not talking about doing that.
Well, I don't want to speak for all.
Right?
I don't want to speak for all members. I only want to speak for myself because I think it depends a bit on what Peter and Katie come back and say. This is would be the cuts, and then if we want to
Okay.
advocate for it. I am very personally aware of the fact that we do not have time. We're in a position a bit where to
Right.
have this ongoing back and forth, this
Well,
and communication is going to be very challenging for the vote.
So that's,
Yeah, so we might be forced into that situation, but I also do think it's hard to say unequivocally without seeing what are the impacts to staffing.
Is that something that we would discuss Wednesday at our school committee meeting? Because we would obviously have to get to a decision.
Yeah, we're meeting tomorrow with our principals, our district leadership team is meeting tomorrow, so it's, we can bring back there. We have talked previously about looking at when you requested us looking at that new proposed budget. That was cutting roughly $1 million out of the budget, so we've done some of that work already, so we can return to that tomorrow. Be prepared to also look at what, and then Kitty and I talked about in terms of the reserve and that 700, how much of that do we need to keep going into next year with the revised budget at 5.7.
And I think I also want to know how does closing our deficit this year fit in with that and what we're rolling into next year, because if that's the route we. I know
Yeah.
there's slides on it, but just
Yeah.
kind of, because that's a big part of all of this too.
It is. Do we want to jump to FY25? Amanda, can you see that?
It said yep, I can.
All right. Most of this is the presentation Peter and Katie gave last Wednesday. So all these are those same slides in terms of the updates. So this was kind of the last update last week. So, Peter, do you want to walk through the update?
Go to the next slide. So, on Wednesday, we talked about, both things that we had added to a slide, I guess on the previous slide, slide 7. The two things that we built into, from the 1.3, the 4888 is the, in terms of where we believe, potential circuit breaker funding is going, which would, be an additional $488,000 in FY25.
Yeah.
And we have also included in that, from the 883, the request to rescind our ask for Chromebooks under top units. It's 391, that's $75,000.
Well,
And appropriate that.
Sorry. So in the one we talked about last week, it just included, it assumed those were happening.
I
and took it out.
thought it only assumed the Chromebooks.
It did last week when Wednesday when we talked about this. So for this one, it's just, if we don't assume that, because we can't just say that it's going to happen 100%. So the deficit is this amount. And then this is the projected with kind of all the other things we talked about, which is here, which includes the assumption of removal of Chromebooks and the RTU.
And it sounds like we need to talk a little bit more about the water bill and what that potential number might be.
So I think, we had talked about, just one of the options was delaying payment, but we cannot, that's not an option, but we are still looking at, just that there was going to be a modification to the invoices for this year.
But we don't have
Just
the number.
because of the water bill, the water meter not being accurate.
Yeah, but we don't have a sense of what that number is.
Not yet.
Okay.
It's still working.
Do you have a sense of when we will have that?
UW said they expected maybe within a week they should have, they looked at the numbers, they agreed that they didn't look right, and they're working through it with the water meter company and software system. So hopefully within a week we should have more information on that. And if it is truly a meter issue, then the usage, other than seasonal fluctuation, should be similar to recent years. Then here's to that significant outlier bill.
So we had discussed those two offsets last week as well. That was community schools, but the increase in fees, just something we have discussed outside of this, more of the revenue from community schools, and then the additional offset from transportation.
What is the current balance of the community schools?
I think it's just over $1 million.
And how much have we taken so far?
So community schools is just over $1 million. It's $1,045,000. That's the current ending balance. Typically we take the funding, offset happens at the end of the year. So we haven't taken anything for this year. We originally built in 250,000. So this would be another 50,000. So it would be 50,000. And then that ending balance is just a snapshot as of last week. And it just doesn't account, that's not a projection to the end of the year. So it doesn't account for the expenses that will incur over the next several months or the revenue that we'll receive. So that balance may continue to go down. And it will be less than $1 million at the end of the fiscal year.
And do you need to carry $1 million balance in order for to not increase the fees, or is that something?
So for next year, we will, in order for community schools to be a self-sustaining, meaning that not having to fund the operations through operating budget, we'll have to increase the tuition. We're looking at an increase between 10 and 15%, just to make sure that we're self-sustaining for FY20.
I'd also talked about two different stipends that are non-student facing. The stipend committee work, what would remain would be our equity leads, just committee work, not student facing, and then facilitator stipends. And then we've got the large group subcoverage, which we also discussed.
Is there anywhere else we can cut so that we're not doing this large group sub coverage? Because we have a lot.
I mean, we've talked about the things that are on the top. I've crossed them out after talking about the impact to students.
Right.
The other thing we talked about, which is on slide 9, is HRS positions. I have not put this on here because these positions, there are only 29 in the district. They're integral to operations on kind of every level, and just pulling them out be significantly impactful to both staff, to students, to community. It is something I can. We meet tomorrow with the district leadership team. It's something I can bring to them to look at more deeply, see if there's something we can do on that front. The capital projects, and Katie, I don't know if you have any further information on that. I believe we've already done everything we can with our capital projects to date, unless someone don't know about.
I don't know.
Okay.
But to your question, Anna, I guess with what you just said, the answer is sort of no. So if we were to choose to not move forward with the large group sub coverage because of concerns about the impact on students,
Directly
then
on students. So
that would lead that line to
yes, by 20.
strike through and moved up to the category above, that this was something we considered and didn't enact, but that would then mean this 213, 214 is actually 237, 238. And that's the amount that we're at. Yep. So
Share these actions that y'all took.
So, Sarah boosters are kind of helping where they can. We are working with Karen Cahill on all the expenses coming towards the end of the year. That's happening. Working. Mentioned some of these boosters and be to address some of those costs.
what are the next steps?
Well, the next steps in mind, we still have a best case scenario here, $213,000 deficit. Right. So only two things lingering, and Amanda, I see your hand, sorry, just finished thought, are one, we're saying we actually don't think there's anything here. And the other is, obviously, again, these are people in important positions and many of them, and very impactful. Can you provide the clarity though on just like why the HRS positions are
Yeah.
listed here and not other positions? I think that has come up consistently.
For people listening in, that's important.
So our HR positions are positions. Contracted the same way that our other positions are. Over the documents that we look at for FY 26, if we're looking at 26. Include contracted and non-contracted. Within the current year. So December or whatever time. Those contracts are within everyone the entire year. Charge positions are different.
So to put it another way, there's again no cost savings within the current fiscal year for cutting any positions other than HRS positions. So as we look at addressing that, the deficit, the only position cuts that would affect this 213 number would be HRS positions. If that is a path forward that we choose to go.
Just to clarify, and that's specific to looking at employees, current employees, but we do, as another one of the measures that we put into place, we have a hiring freeze. So if anytime anyone leaves, resigns, we've put a limit, we're not hiring new positions.
Some of those are contracted.
And some of those are contracted positions, so those positions are, we're not hiring kind of a full-time replacement, we're using subs, we're using other kind of like mechanisms to try to cover that work for the remainder of the year. Just to like have additional cost saving.
But as of now, those savings to date are reflected within
Correct.
this.
They're reflected.
Questions or thoughts, 100%?
Amanda was.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Amanda, you didn't have your hand up. Thank you, Lizzie.
No, you covered it. I was going to ask about clarifying the contracted positions.
The other thing that help us was there any way with any of our costs of 25 to move to 26. Sounds like I'm not sure if there's more to look into on that with various costs that are
I thought y'all were looking into council on that.
It seemed like we had received some advice that
Yeah.
that wouldn't be advisable.
Right.
So then is there an option to use free cash to cover that balance?
So that's not, it is an option for us to request that of the select board, the town. So I guess again, what continue to push beyond here is got an operating deficit. At this point, we don't have enough money to get through June 30th. That's what y'all been telling us, and y'all I know have been working diligently to try and shrink it, and this is pretty strong. Although again, the 213 number is best case scenario here. It's probably somewhere between those two things. And so we either need to understand if the HRS cuts close that gap, or if there are other things that are not included on this, or we need you to tell us that y'all can't close the gap. And
yeah, I mean, I think we're at a point right now where like we talked about this previously of requesting, and whether it's from requesting from the sped stabilization to request 300,000 that into FY25. I believe that's kind of where we are right now in terms of our ability to close this gap.
Like we won't be able to close it. So about taking.
but I think before we get to that point, what seems to be a lingering thing here is we need to hear from you detail on the HRS impacts. Because it may be that when you're able to explain to us the impact of, and I don't think we're not talking about all of those positions, but some, or what would that look like? What would that mean? We obviously understand it would be a terrible impact on those individuals, but in addition, what are we talking about? The impact for students and the operations of the schools. I think that's a missing piece for us still. So maybe on Wednesday, if you have this conversation tomorrow, can you bring us that information on Wednesday? Because I think that we need the opportunity to hear that. And that determines whether that option, which has been discussed, that, you know, based more or less abstractly for a little while now. When you present that to us, it allows us to determine whether that joins the strike throughs, some things we've considered and realize we are not able to justify doing, but we're not able to do that yet because you haven't been able to give us the detail yet. So that's for Wednesday. But I know the select board is meeting tomorrow night. And I know that you were looking for the clarity heading into that meeting tomorrow night. But based on the conversation we've just been having here, I think we want to make sure that if we're making a request, we aren't taking it lightly and we're not making that request until we know that that's like every option has been considered. And right, so Nick, like maybe on timing, like can you help us understand what you would recommend or how we should handle this? Because if we're able to Wednesday morning get what seems to be the final layer of information around the FY25 options, not that they're attractive options, but they are technically our options. And if we make a decision Wednesday, what does that mean for you all? If we were to basically need to come with a request in that ballpark.
Yes,
Knowing it hinges on capital on Wednesday morning as well, which is right before Wednesday morning finance.
So I think, you know, in terms of the update I can share tomorrow night is that you're continuing to work on it and want to, you know, make a request once you've really gone through all possible options more closely. In terms of what procedurally needs to happen is we would need a warrant article for the May town meeting or for the potential June special town meeting that requests an appropriation of free cash or whatever the total amount of free cash is. So if it's the Chromebooks and the RTU capital request and any additional increment, then that could be one single warrant article. So we're going to need a warrant article, it sounds most likely. So I think at the very least that can be reported back is that schools will be requesting a warrant article for free cash appropriation, perhaps just for capital allocation, perhaps higher than that, but we'll know later. And then again, process-wise in terms of the annual town meeting in May or June, it sounds like having that certainty in May rather than in June is preferable. And then the question for the select board is, you know, do we appropriate that to the reserve fund so it's there for the warrant committee to then allocate to the school department, or does it get appropriated directly to the school department? So I'll speak with numbers about that. But I think I have what I need now because there is going to be a request for a warrant article from the sound of it. It's just a question of what that amount is. And our select board meets again at our regular meeting next Tuesday. So we can share the update tomorrow night. Any feedback can be shared with the school committee from there, and then
We can share a further update
on Tuesday.
afterwards. Okay.
Amanda?
Thanks. So can I bring up just one other question only because it came up earlier? Do we feel like this number is fully reflective of things that we've heard about special ed for FY25? I mean, is this do we see this number changing based on that? I just think I want to make sure that we're taking that into account now. I don't know if it has been. I don't know if there's an issue or a number that we have, but I know that that was part of an earlier conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to, I know Joanna had brought this up. I with her CPAC hat on. Connecting with the community and knowing kind of what some of the impacts could be. So I think that's something for us to bring Wednesday and for Danielle to speak to in terms of kind of current budget, what we're looking at ahead, and any kind of restructuring that we can do internally as we're looking at and predicting some of these things. And I think a lot of the time, when things surprise us, when a student enters, like whether they're entering in preschool or they're moving in, the further ahead we can see that, the more we can take time to make some moves internally. Whereas when it happens right away, it's a lot harder for us to do that. So that was something that I'll talk about with Danielle. Kitty and I will talk about with Danielle, and we'll for Wednesday.
I guess this, I didn't know 100%. I think this was better you were asking Nick, but what is the drop dead date for a number? It's like,
I would say Tuesday, the 25th would be the drop dead. Ideally, it would be tomorrow, but we have to live in the real world in terms of sometimes needing a little bit more time. But I would say we wouldn't even have clarity on the capital either tomorrow night.
Right.
But we can just provide that. The process that's being followed.
so we then need clarity on a final number. Yeah, Wednesday, unless, we want to push it to Monday with the school committee at 5 minutes.
And just one other, and I know I've shared this with a few folks, but annual town meeting is appropriations for the fiscal year beginning July 1. So to amend budget appropriations for the current fiscal year, the practice is to typically post a special within the annual. So that may be something we have to do. So just so there's transparency about that, it might look a little different, would be a special town meeting that occurs on the same date as the annual town meeting. With a specific warrant article related to amending fiscal 25 appropriations. So another just a kind of unique process.
So then just so I have some clarity before I have to head out. But so for Wednesday, we're gonna look at the HRS positions and kind of, look at what those impacts would be. And then also look at the $7,000, what those reductions might end up looking like if we have to go that route, right?
And we have Danielle coming to look at special ed.
Okay.
Still.
I think we have to determine if it's going to be the FY26, whether that goes directly to school committee. It might make sense to do.
And I know you got to run. I just want to flag there are 3 motions we need to do. You don't want to stay for them, can't stay for them. Well, at least make sure you're aware of what they are. But essentially, a couple of things. First one is the select board. I've talked about this Fed stabilization fund, which I'm appreciative of, and I especially want to say appreciative of Katie for bringing this idea to the town. Right? Nobody was talking about this, so I really appreciate that. And I think that is helpful in the long term. But technically, the school committee needs to request the establishment of a stabilization fund for special education, is my understanding, to start that process. So that's the first motion. And the other 2 motions are kind of going back to how we are looking to close the gap. The capital requests, we would need to, as a committee, request to rescind those and then ask for those to be reallocated to our per year operating budget.
So I have a question on that. For the 391, are we adding that into the FY26 budget then?
No, that would be coming out of the capital request for
For next year.
FY26.
Okay. Yeah.
So it wouldn't affect our FY 26 operating budget, but it would affect.
But does that mean that there are other capital requests that we're pushing off to take that money for schools?
Yeah, that's
So-
what will be discussed on Wednesday by capital, which is why the capital, like, they may not approve this for that
Right.
reason.
Right,
So that
right,
will,
because they're pushing off other things to give us that money in the form of.
in the first
cash.
place,
Yeah,
in the first place. So that's why we need to have that discussion and that's why we can request it. And then that meets 7 a.m. Wednesday.
so if they say
So-
no, then that 214 or whatever we saw could
Increases by 3 years.
It will go back up.
Yeah, that's why
Okay.
the 883 is the thing we have more certainty on, actually.
Okay,
And even that is not 100, 1372 is the thing we have certainty on.
But
that's our deficit, basically.
But we'll have
Not
that-
These things, yeah, okay,
knowledge when we have Wednesday finance, because capital will have met. So then we can know, it's a constant every day, like trying to be updated with where we're at. So, and they're coming as separate because they are they're two different.
right, and, yeah. So then do we have, if we were to go with a 1.3 ask, is there enough funds to appropriate that money to close the gap for FY 25?
There is free cash available in excess of that amount, but it's all
That would be,
kind of earmarked towards things for future years, like the operating budget stabilization fund, expense savings fund.
Yeah.
There's $4.5 million in free cash that was certified, but we've kind of identified places for it also.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
I mean, we gotta get-
plain, okay,
I mean, this gets a little bit to your point on the group sub coverage, like I hate that idea. I think it's terrible.
I mean, it's
I agree with you.
$24,000, it's not a big cost savings, I mean, that.
But every
like,
little bit though is
Right,
what
I
I think we're gonna be
understand.
pushed on by the
But-
select board in the town to reduce our.
When that was done previously, a lot of people left Milton Public Schools. So I just don't think if you add that in to show $24,000 of cost savings is a good way to get support for an override. I'm just gonna put it out there. It's just like the sports, you don't touch certain things. So, anyway, I gotta run. Thanks, guys. Thanks.
All right, so any other questions on these motions? All right, then I will make some motions. I will make a motion to request that the town of Milton establish a stabilization fund for a special education. We need to do a roll call vote because Amanda is remote. Amanda,
Yes.
Lizzie,
Yes.
Lynn,
Yes.
and Al, are you there?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. All right, I will make a motion to request to rescind the school capital budget request of $391,000 for Chromebooks and request that the town reallocate that funding to the FY 25 school operating budget. Is there a second?
Second.
Sorry. All in favor, Val,
Yes.
Amanda,
Yes.
Lizzie,
Yes.
Lynn?
Yes.
Yes. Finally, motion to request to rescind school capital budget requests of $75,000 for rooftop unit upgrades / improvements and request that the town reallocate that funding to the FY 25 school operating budgets. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor, Val,
Yes.
Amanda,
Yes.
Yes.
Lizzie, Selena?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Anything else on FY 25? All right, we have meetings, just upcoming meetings next, this Wednesday, next Monday and Wednesday as well. So we talked about Wednesday will be when, Danielle will join. Just need to figure out again how forward in that meeting. I think we'll probably write you about the first time we'll be looking at the FY 26 updated budget request would be that evening. Also, just to get you all that sort of data to talk about. We approve some meeting minutes? Okay, I will make a motion to approve meeting minutes for March 10th and March 12th. there a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor, Amanda?
I have to abstain from March 10th because I wasn't there.
All
Oh,
right,
wait.
let me split the motion and I'll say.
No, wait, sorry, I was thinking that you were talking about, the last meeting. So yes,
All right. Selena?
Yes.
And I am a yes. Great. Minutes are approved. Anything else discussed related to the agenda for our next meeting? And I will make a motion to adjourn. There a second? All in favor, Amanda?
yes.
Selena? I'm a yes. Thank you, everyone.